Hello and welcome. Where are you listening from today? Is it morning where you are, sunlight filtering gently through the curtains, coffee cooling beside you? Or night, with the hum of the world gone quiet, and only the soft glow of your screen to keep you company? Wherever you are, and whenever this moment finds you, I invite you to sit with a question, one that hums quietly at the edges of science and imagination, history and myth. What if we are not the first? What if, long before our cities glittered under the night sky, before our satellites traced bright arcs around the Earth, before the first human chiseled a tool from stone, another civilization had already risen and fallen, leaving almost nothing behind? It sounds impossible at first, doesn't it? We think of ourselves as the culmination, the apex of evolution and progress. Our history books stretch back thousands of years, carefully tracing the rise of agriculture, writing, kingdoms, empires. We measure our achievements in monuments and machines, in our ability to shape the planet itself. And yet Earth is old, so very old, 4.5 billion years old, a span of time so vast that it swallows human history whole, reducing everything we have built, everything we have been, to the thinnest layer of dust on the surface of a mountain. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, have existed for about 300,000 years. Complex civilizations, the kind that leave cities and writing and monuments, have existed for maybe 6,000 years. That is not even a blink compared to the deep time of this planet. What happened in all the time before us? This question is not entirely new. It has flickered in the minds of thinkers for centuries, from ancient philosophers imagining cycles of creation and destruction, to modern scientists probing the geological record for anomalies, to writers and dreamers spinning stories of lost continents and forgotten empires. And in recent years, it has taken on new shape. Serious scientists, planetary scientists, climatologists, geologists have begun to ask with careful precision whether it is possible that some kind of industrial civilization could have risen millions of years ago and vanished, leaving little or no trace that we can easily recognize today. They call this line of inquiry the Silurian hypothesis, named, somewhat playfully, after the reptilian race of scientists in an old British science fiction show. But beneath the whimsical name lies a serious, fascinating question. If there had been a civilization before us, how would we know? Would its bones have turned to dust? Would its cities have crumbled, erased by tectonic drift and erosion? Would its machines and monuments have dissolved, leaving only the faintest chemical fingerprints in the rocks? And if that is true, if the record of our own existence could be scrubbed away in the space of a few million years, then what does that say about the stories we tell ourselves of being the first, the only, the inevitable? So tonight, or today, or in whatever quiet space you have carved out to listen, let us follow that question where it leads. Let us walk backward through time, past the written word, past the painted caves, past the slow unfolding of human history, into the deep layers of Earth's memory. Let us look for signs, for possibilities, for the strange and the subtle clues that whisper of worlds that might have been. Not to claim certainty, because the truth is we do not know, but to dwell for a while in the wonder of the possible. To even begin to imagine another civilization before ours, we have to first step out of the narrow window of human time and into the vast expanse of deep time. Think of Earth as a book. Human history, all of it, is not even a single page. It is a thin line of ink in the corner of a margin. Everything else, billions of years of shifting continents, erupting volcanoes, rising and falling seas, and the slow, relentless churn of life, fills the rest of the chapters. Geologists divide this book into eras and periods: the Precambrian, the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, the Cenozoic. Each one spans millions, sometimes hundreds of millions, of years. Entire ecosystems have risen and vanished in those pages, leaving only fragments behind. A tooth here, a fossilized leaf there, a smear of carbon in the rock. The deeper you go, the sparser the record becomes. The Earth is a restless archivist. It does not keep its shelves neat and orderly. Plates shift, mountains rise, oceans open and close, glaciers scrape the surface clean, and entire layers of history are swallowed, melted, and rewritten. If our civilization vanished tomorrow, how long would our traces last? Our cities, with their steel and glass, would crumble in decades. Bridges would collapse, roads would crack and be overgrown. Within a few thousand years, the outlines of our built world would blur under forests and deserts and shifting sands. Give it 1,000,000 years, and almost everything we have made, everything, would be gone. Steel and concrete and plastic would degrade, ground into dust, carried by wind and water to the depths of the ocean, or buried beneath new layers of sediment. What might remain? Perhaps the odd artifact, encased in some protective layer of mud or ice. Perhaps strange chemical signatures in the soil, traces of our fertilizers, our plastics, our sudden spike in carbon. Perhaps a thin band in the geological record, marking the Anthropocene, that strange and sudden era when one species remade the surface of the world. But the cities, the monuments, the endless noise of our presence, they would be gone. And if that is true for us, if we, with all our industry and technology and reach, could vanish so completely in the space of geological time, then what of a civilization that rose, say, 20 million years ago? Or 200 million? What would they have left for us to find? This is the unsettling, humbling core of the Silurian hypothesis. The Earth forgets. It forgets almost everything. And in that forgetting, entire worlds could be erased, entire stories lost, entire civilizations reduced to whispers in the rock. This does not mean that such a civilization existed. It is important to be clear about that. There is no hard evidence, no fossilized machines, no inexplicable artifacts, no clear signs that point to a non-human intelligence shaping the planet before us. But the absence of evidence, the scientists remind us, is not always the evidence of absence. Sometimes it is simply a reminder of how little survives the grinding wheel of deep time. And so the question lingers, quiet but persistent. If we are not the first, then who came before? And if they were here, if they built and dreamed and fell, what might they have known? What lessons might they have left? If only we could learn to read the language of stone. To search for a civilization lost to deep time, you have to think like a geologist. You have to look not at the surface, the familiar layer of soil and sand and grass we walk on, but deeper into the compressed stories that the earth keeps beneath our feet. Every layer of rock is a page. Some pages are crisp and clear, telling you exactly what they were at the time they were written. A floodplain, a volcanic ash deposit, the slow settling of ancient seas. Others are smudged, half-burned, rewritten by forces far beyond our scale. When scientists consider the possibility of a past civilization, they ask a simple, careful question. What kinds of traces would an industrial society leave behind, even millions of years later? One answer is chemical signatures. Right now, we are leaving such signatures everywhere. The air holds far more carbon dioxide than it did a century ago, most of it bearing the unmistakable isotopic fingerprint of fossil fuels. The soils are saturated with nitrogen from fertilizers. The oceans hold traces of plastics, microbeads, and fibers so small they move invisibly through entire food chains. If we vanished, those signals would settle into the sediment. Millions of years from now, a geologist digging into that layer would find a thin band of unusual chemistry, a sudden spike of carbon, a strange distribution of heavy metals, maybe even bits of plastic that resisted complete decay. If an earlier civilization had burned fossil fuels or used large-scale industry, they too might have left such a chemical footprint. Not the artifacts themselves, but the ghost of their existence, recorded in the altered balance of the planet's chemistry. Another clue might be geological disruptions. Civilizations shape landscapes. They dam rivers, cut canals, mine mountains, divert waters, and build vast networks of roads and cities. Most of these changes erode quickly, but some might last. A sudden unnatural pattern of sediments, or the remains of unusual excavations, might whisper of hands long gone. There is also the possibility of strange minerals. Modern technology creates materials that don't form naturally, alloys, ceramics, and composites that would, in theory, fossilize in some contexts. If an ancient society had its own versions of these materials, their remains might still be there, tiny inclusions in the rock, waiting for someone to notice. So far, though, we have not found anything that clearly fits. There are anomalies, puzzling deposits, unexplained shifts in climate or chemistry, curious gaps in the record, but nothing that demands the conclusion of an ancient civilization. Yet that in itself is revealing. It shows just how delicate such evidence would be, how easily erased by time. It reminds us that the Earth's memory, though deep, is also profoundly selective. And perhaps that is why the question lingers. Not because we have proof, but because we understand now how little proof there would be, even if such a thing had ever existed. There are moments in the geological record that make scientists pause. Not because they reveal obvious signs of past civilizations, but because they hint at disruptions, sudden dramatic shifts that don't yet have simple explanations. One example is the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, around 56 million years ago. In the geological record, there is a sharp spike in global temperatures and a sudden increase in carbon levels, eerily reminiscent of what we are doing to the planet now. The cause is still debated. Massive volcanic eruptions, methane releases from the ocean floor, some other natural trigger. But for some, the pattern sparks an unsettling thought. What if it wasn't purely natural? What if it was the footprint of something more? Another is the carbon isotope excursions scattered throughout deep time. These are periods where the balance of carbon isotopes in the rock suddenly shifts, often accompanied by changes in climate and mass extinctions. Most of these, too, are linked to natural events, but they remind us of how easy it would be, from the perspective of deep time, to mistake the fingerprint of industry for a geological hiccup. Then there are the unusual fossils and artifacts that sometimes surface, not convincing evidence on their own, but intriguing enough to feed the imagination. A strange metal sphere found in ancient rock, explained as a natural concretion, but still oddly regular. Tiny spiral-shaped structures in mineral deposits that some claim resemble manufactured objects, but most experts dismiss as natural formations. Skepticism is important here. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence, and so far, none of these anomalies meet that standard. But their existence does something subtler. It keeps the door open, just a crack for possibility. Because if we know one thing, it is that deep time is full of surprises. Life itself is proof of that. Complex, improbable, endlessly adaptive. The idea that, in all the billions of years before us, nothing ever rose to complexity, nothing ever built, nothing ever dreamed, that too is a kind of extraordinary claim. And so we hold the tension. On one side, the hard data we have, no clear evidence of past civilizations. On the other, the vast, humbling realization that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is in that tension that imagination thrives, not wild fantasy, but careful, disciplined curiosity. What might an advanced civilization have looked like millions of years ago? What technologies would they have developed? What mistakes might they have made? And what, if anything, might they have left behind for us to find? This is not idle speculation. It has practical value too. Scientists studying the what-if of ancient civilizations are also, in a sense, studying us, what our footprint will look like millions of years from now, how our choices will echo through deep time, what traces of our own existence will remain long after we are gone. Perhaps that is the quiet gift of this question. It reminds us that we are temporary, that our mark on the planet is both profound and fleeting, that we are, like every species before us, just one thread in a story much larger and longer than we can see. And if we listen carefully, that humility carries with it a kind of responsibility to write our part of the story with care, to think about the future layers of rock and what story they will tell about us. If we let the mind wander carefully and deliberately, we can begin to sketch what a civilization before ours might have been like, not in detail, because detail is the first thing to be swallowed by time, but in the broader strokes that define any intelligent species trying to understand its world. Would they have looked like us? Perhaps not. The odds are slim that evolution, with all its branching, chaotic paths, would have led to the same shape twice. They might have been reptilian or avian, or something so alien to our eyes that we would not immediately recognize their intelligence. What matters more is not their form, but their minds, that they could wonder, build, and change their environment. Like us, they would have discovered patterns in nature. They might have mapped the stars, tracked the seasons, measured time in cycles of sun and moon. They would have learned to shape tools, first from the world around them, and later from materials of their own invention. In that sense, the path to technology is almost inevitable for any species driven by curiosity and survival. And then, perhaps they built cities, not like ours, but their own versions of communal spaces, hubs where knowledge and resources pooled, where ideas cross-pollinated. Perhaps they learned to harness energy in ways we can barely imagine. Not fossil fuels, but something cleaner, something less destructive. Or perhaps, like us, they leaned first into what was easy, the combustible riches of their world, the ancient stores of energy locked beneath the surface, and in using them, began to alter their planet. Did they leave art? Did they tell stories? Did they paint their equivalents of caves, build monuments to their dead, carve symbols into stone? If they did, those monuments are almost certainly gone now, ground down by erosion, buried beneath layers of earth, carried into the sea, or subducted into the molten churn of the mantle. Even their bones would be gone, in all likelihood. Fossilization is rare, a freak occurrence that requires just the right conditions of burial and mineralization. Of the billions of humans who have ever lived, only a fraction would fossilize under the best circumstances. Multiply that by the endless churn of deep time, and the odds of finding even a single skeleton of a hypothetical ancient species shrink to almost nothing. But perhaps, just perhaps, something small might endure, a fragment of material in the rock unusual in its chemistry, a thin layer of isotopic oddities marking an era when the planet's balance shifted sharply, a sudden extinction that arrived too quickly, too violently, to be fully explained by natural causes. These would not be definitive proof, but they would be whispers. And whispers, in the language of science, are enough to keep the question alive. This exercise, imagining a civilization erased, is not fantasy for its own sake. It is a way of seeing ourselves more clearly. Because what we imagine for them is, in many ways, what will happen to us. Our monuments will vanish, our roads will crumble, our satellites will fall from the sky, burn in the atmosphere, and scatter as dust. What will remain are the subtle things, the chemistry of our age, the altered distribution of life, the thin line of plastic and metal that future geologists might puzzle over. And in that mirror, we see something humbling, that for all our sense of permanence, we are as fleeting as any species, any civilization, any era, that our greatest achievements, our tallest towers, our most advanced machines, all of them are temporary, all of them are fragile in the face of deep time. Perhaps that is why the question matters, not because it gives us answers about what came before, but because it asks us to reckon with what we are leaving behind, and what story it will tell to those, if any, who come after. Civilizations fall, we know this. History is full of their endings. Cities abandoned, languages forgotten, knowledge lost to fire and conquest and time. But history also teaches us something more subtle, that collapse rarely comes from one cause alone. It is a convergence, a tangle of pressures that finally snaps the threads holding a society together. If a civilization rose millions of years ago, its end could have come in many ways. One is climate catastrophe. The balance of a planet is delicate, and any industrial society that alters that balance risks tipping it too far. Rising temperatures, shifting weather, collapsing ecosystems. These are forces that, left unchecked, could render a world unlivable for the very species that transformed it. Perhaps, in the deep past, a civilization reached that threshold and could not pull back in time. Another is natural disaster. The Earth is restless. Volcanoes, earthquakes, asteroid impacts. These events are rare on a human timescale, but inevitable on a geological one. An impact like the one that ended the reign of the dinosaurs 66 million years ago could in an instant erase the infrastructure and population of any advanced society, leaving survivors scattered and broken, their knowledge dwindling with each generation until nothing remained. There is also the quieter, slower unravelling of resource depletion. Civilizations, by their nature, consume. They build and grow, and in that growth, they draw down the reserves of their world, sometimes faster than those reserves can replenish. Perhaps an ancient society reached a point where the energy and materials it depended on were exhausted, and with no alternatives, it dwindled, receded, and finally disappeared. And then there is conflict. Intelligence brings cooperation, but it also brings competition, ambition, fear. If a species discovered the means to destroy itself, through weapons, through engineered plagues, through the cascading effects of ecological collapse, it is possible that they, like us, stood on the knife edge of annihilation and tipped the wrong way. But the most likely scenario, scientists suggest, is not a single dramatic event, but a combination of pressures: environmental stress, social strain, dwindling resources, and perhaps a sudden shock, a volcanic winter, an impact, a pandemic, that pushed a fragile system past the point of recovery. In that sense, imagining their fall is less about mystery and more about a reflection of what we already know: that complexity carries risk, that the same intelligence that builds can also destroy, that survival is never guaranteed. And then, once the fall came, time did the rest. Forests grew over their ruins, oceans rose and swallowed their coasts, winds and rains eroded their monuments, tectonic plates dragged their cities into the deep mantle, recycling even their strongest materials into magma. In 1,000,000 years, there was nothing left. In 10 million, even the memory of their existence had been erased from the surface of the earth. All that would remain are the faintest echoes, chemical anomalies, odd mineral inclusions, patterns in the fossil record that hint but never quite prove that something once moved across this world with minds and hands and dreams. This is not a story of despair. If anything, it is a story of perspective. It reminds us that life goes on, that after every collapse, after every extinction, after every erasure, the earth rebuilds, slowly and patiently, in ways that are always surprising. And perhaps that is the most haunting thought of all, that if we were to vanish tomorrow, the earth would grieve us only briefly, and then move on, filling the spaces we left behind with new forms, new possibilities, new stories that will never know we were here. When you widen your view to deep time, something shifts inside you. The frantic urgency of the present moment, the endless news cycles, the politics, the noise, seems to quiet just a little. You begin to feel the vastness of the story you are standing in. And with that comes something rare in our age: perspective. If we are not the first, or if we could someday vanish so completely that only a faint chemical fingerprint remains, then what does it really mean to be advanced? It cannot simply mean building taller towers, faster machines, or more complex systems. Those are milestones, yes, but they are also fragile. They rise quickly, and they can fall just as quickly. Deep time reminds us that what endures is not the height of the structure, but the harmony of the system that built it. Perhaps the mark of a truly advanced civilization is not how loudly it reshapes its world, but how quietly it learns to live within its limits. Think of the great trees, the redwoods and sequoias. They are not advanced in the way we usually define it. They don't build cities, they don't send messages across space, and yet for thousands of years they have thrived. They grow in balance with their ecosystems, shaping and shaped by the world around them. Or think of the coral reefs, intricate, interconnected cities built not by architects, but by tiny polyps, layer by patient layer, sustained for millennia by cooperation and balance. What if that, not conquest or consumption, is the real measure of progress? The ability to persist without collapse, to create abundance without erasure, to leave behind not scars but thriving systems that carry your story forward. Imagining an ancient civilization forces us to ask, if they existed, did they learn that lesson? And if they did not, what can we learn from their absence? Maybe they reached heights we can't yet imagine, energy drawn from the fabric of physics itself, communication spanning continents in ways we can barely conceive. Maybe their science unlocked mysteries we still struggle to name, and yet perhaps none of it could save them from the slow erosion of imbalance. And here we are now, standing on the edge of our own decisions, asking ourselves what story we want to leave behind. Will our thin line in the rock layers tell a story of carelessness, of squandered abundance, of potential undone by hubris? Or will it whisper of a species that learned, just in time, to see itself not as separate from the world, but as part of it? Deep time humbles, but it also empowers. It shows us that we are not insignificant. We are participants in a grand ongoing experiment of life. What we do matters, not because we will be remembered. The earth does not keep memories the way we do, but because our choices ripple outward into the systems that will shape what comes next. And maybe that is the quiet invitation hidden in this question. To stop thinking of advanced as a race to climb ever higher, and start thinking of it as a practice of learning how to endure, how to belong, how to live in such a way that 1,000,000 years from now, some future mind studying the layers of rock will find not a scar, but a sign of balance. For as long as we have told stories, we have imagined that we are the beginning, the first people, the chosen people, the pinnacle of some grand unfolding that has led inevitably to us. But deep time tells another story, one in which we are not the beginning and not the inevitable outcome, but one chapter among many. This is not a story meant to diminish us. In many ways, it enlarges us, placing us in a lineage not of blood but of possibility, a lineage of beings who have looked at the world and wondered what lay beyond the horizon, who have reached out, built, dreamed, and changed the course of their planet. When you let go of the myth of the first, you begin to see the world differently. The fossils in the museum are no longer just relics of a past unrelated to us. They are hints of a continuum, a reminder that intelligence and complexity may bloom in many forms, in many times, given enough patience and chance. You also start to see your own life in a softer light, the drive to be remembered, to leave a mark, to carve your name deep enough that time cannot erase it. It quiets a little, because deep time erases everything. And yet in that erasure, there is a kind of peace. You realize that meaning is not found in permanence, but in participation, in the simple act of being here, in this brief moment, part of the unfolding story. This perspective also reframes our search for life elsewhere. If we are not the first here, why would we be the first anywhere? Perhaps intelligence blooms often in the universe, rising and falling like tides, leaving behind traces so faint that only those who look closely and patiently might ever find them. It reminds us, too, that the signs we seek of alien civilizations, the great beacons, the megastructures, the undeniable signals, may be rare, not because intelligence is rare, but because time is long and civilizations are brief. If we want to understand what we are looking for, we need only look at ourselves. What traces would we leave if we vanished tomorrow? And how easily would they fade into silence? In this way, the myth of the first collapses, and what takes its place is something both humbler and more profound. The awareness that we are part of a continuum far larger than we can grasp, a thread in a tapestry that stretches not just across space, but across eons. And maybe, just maybe, that awareness changes the way we live. Maybe it makes us kinder, less certain of our supremacy, more willing to see ourselves as stewards rather than conquerors. Maybe it teaches us that progress is not a straight line, but a cycle of learning, forgetting, and learning again. In the quiet of that realization, you might feel something unexpected. Not despair, but wonder. Wonder that you are here at all, in this improbable moment, with this improbable mind, standing in the long shadow of deep time, looking forward and backward, and realizing that, for all we do not know, for all that will be forgotten, this, right now, is extraordinary. Technology is often the measure we use to declare ourselves advanced. From the first chipped stone tools to the intricate circuitry of a quantum processor, we map progress as a line from simple to complex, from fire to fusion, from survival to mastery. But mastery is an illusion. Deep time shows us this. The Earth is not conquered, it is only borrowed, briefly, by whatever species happens to rise high enough to believe it owns the place. And sooner or later, the balance shifts. If there were civilizations before us, they likely faced the same paradox we do now, the tension between power and balance. The more you build, the more you consume. The more you consume, the more you risk breaking the systems that sustain you. Consider our world today. We have created a global civilization of extraordinary complexity. Our networks span the planet. Our machines mine the deep oceans and peer into distant galaxies. We have bent rivers, leveled forests, and lit up the night with our cities. And yet, for all that, we are vulnerable. A shift in climate threatens coastlines and crops. A microscopic virus can stall economies and reveal the fragility of our global web. A disruption in one part of the system ripples across the rest in ways we often fail to predict. This fragility is not unique to us. Any society that grows complex enough to depend on delicate, interconnected systems will eventually face this same precarious balance. And perhaps, in the deep past, another intelligence stood where we stand now, looking out across its own achievements, feeling both the pride of creation and the unease of knowing that everything it had built rested on foundations it barely understood. If we listen carefully, the earth whispers reminders of this truth. The forests that absorb our carbon, the oceans that moderate our climate, the thin, delicate atmosphere that keeps us alive. These are not separate from us. They are part of the same system that allows our technology, our culture, our existence to flourish. But balance is hard to see when you're inside it. It is only when the system begins to strain, when weather grows erratic, when species vanish, when the quiet rhythms of nature are disrupted, that the illusion of control begins to crumble. This is where the idea of earlier civilizations becomes more than just a curiosity. It becomes a kind of mirror, one that asks, if they fell, what will keep us from following? The answer, if there is one, may not be found in building faster or reaching higher. It may be in slowing down, in listening more closely, in learning to see ourselves not as masters, but as participants, threads in a web we cannot afford to unravel. Technology can be part of that balance if we choose to use it that way. It can help us heal what we have broken, restore what we have stripped away, rebuild systems instead of erasing them. But that requires a shift in how we define progress, not as endless growth, but as harmony, resilience, endurance. Deep time does not reward speed, it rewards adaptability. And perhaps that is the lesson we most need to hear from the imagined ghosts of those who might have come before. That survival is not about how brightly you burn, but about how well you learn to keep the fire alive without consuming everything around you. One of the most haunting realizations in imagining a lost civilization is this: even the most advanced technology, given enough time, fades into silence. Think about our world, the servers that hold our collective memory, the satellites that orbit above us, the endless hum of data flowing through invisible channels. All of it is temporary. Remove the constant care, the constant maintenance, and it will all vanish. In 1,000 years, the digital record of our lives would be gone. In 10,000, the last ruins of our cities would be unrecognizable. In 1,000,000, almost nothing would remain but the faintest chemical traces. If another civilization had risen millions of years ago, their technology might have been breathtaking in ways we can't imagine. Machines that drew power from forces we barely understand. Networks of knowledge that spanned their globe, or perhaps even their solar system. Art, culture, memory, all encoded in forms as ephemeral to deep time as our silicon and glass. And now, nothing. Not because they were not advanced, but because time erases everything that is not constantly renewed. This realization forces a difficult but important question. If permanence is an illusion, what then should technology be for? Perhaps not for monuments, perhaps not for leaving a mark. Perhaps technology, at its best, is a kind of bridge, a way to connect, to understand, to explore, in the brief window we are given. In that sense, what endures is not the thing itself, but the change it makes while it exists. The way a discovery reshapes our understanding of the universe. The way a connection alters the course of a life. The way knowledge ripples through generations, even if the original medium fades. This is where we find a strange kind of comfort, because even if the records vanish, even if the artifacts crumble, something of us persists, in the systems we influence, in the species we protect or endanger, in the chemistry of the world that will carry our story forward in its quiet, indifferent way. Perhaps that is why the idea of being the first is less important than what we do with the moment we have. If others came before, their story has already been written, their lessons already scattered through the rock and soil. Ours is still unfolding, still being shaped with every choice we make, every technology we build, every decision about what to value and what to let go. And in that unfolding, we have a chance, not to escape the inevitability of impermanence, but to leave something deeper than artifacts. A world more whole than we found it, a system more resilient, a balance more enduring. Imagine for a moment that millions of years from now, a future intelligence digs into the layers of rock that mark our age. They will not find our cities or our machines, but maybe, just maybe, they will find something quieter, something subtler, the signs of a world that healed after us, of ecosystems that recovered, of species that flourished because, in the brief moment when we had the power to destroy, we chose instead to repair. That could be our legacy, not the noise of what we built, but the quiet strength of what we left behind. And in that way, technology becomes not just a tool of dominance or growth, but a kind of memory. Not of us specifically, but of what we learned, of how we chose to exist in the brief span we were given. We spend so much of our brief lives trying to be remembered. It is written into our monuments, our art, our stories, our archives, this desperate hope that something of us will survive the long erosion of time. We build towers that scrape the sky, carve our names into stone, etch our knowledge into books and servers, imagining that permanence is something we can command. But deep time humbles all of that. It whispers that permanence is a myth. The pyramids, which feel eternal to us, are barely a moment old in the scale of Earth's history. In 100,000 years, the desert winds will grind them down. In 1,000,000, there may be no trace of them at all. The same is true for our cities, our satellites, our monuments to self-importance. Even our bodies, our bones, our DNA, all of it will be carried away, broken apart, recycled into the endless churn of the planet. When you truly sit with that, there is a moment of fear, a quiet ache that says, if nothing lasts, what is the point? But then, if you keep sitting with it, something shifts. You realize that the point was never to be permanent. The point was to participate. Our legacy is not the mark we leave on stone, but the way we shape the present, the way we alter the flow of life while we are here, the conversations we have, the kindness we offer, the knowledge we build and share, the balance we either respect or disrupt. Imagine that there were civilizations before us. If they have vanished so completely that only faint whispers remain, does that make their existence meaningless? Of course not. They were part of the story. Their rise, their fall, their quiet influence on the systems of this planet, all of it led, in some way, to the world we inherited. Perhaps their energy use altered the chemistry of the oceans in ways that shaped the evolution of certain species. Perhaps their collapse created ecological openings that allowed other forms of life to flourish. Perhaps their absence, their silence, made room for us. Legacy, in this sense, is not about being remembered. It is about the ripples we create, ripples that will continue long after the memory of their source has faded. And so we too will fade. But the ripples we create, in the systems we sustain or destroy, in the choices we make about how to live, will echo forward in ways we cannot see. When you stop chasing the illusion of permanence, you begin to see the quiet power of the present. This moment, this brief life, is the only place where meaning is made. And meaning is not in being. Deep time can make you feel very small. When you think about billions of years, about entire worlds rising and falling in the blink of a geological eye, your own life can feel like less than a heartbeat. But smallness is not the same as insignificance. In fact, there is a strange, quiet power in realizing how connected you are. To the rocks beneath your feet, to the air you breathe, to the deep currents of life that have been flowing across this planet for nearly 4 billion years. Every atom in your body is old, older than the earth, older than the sun, forged in the cores of stars that exploded long before this solar system even formed. When you breathe, when you eat, when you move, you are participating in cycles that began long before there was such a thing as a human being. And every breath you take, every word you speak, every act of care or harm, ripples outward into those same cycles, becoming part of the story that will continue long after you are gone. If there were civilizations before us, they were part of this same tapestry. Their atoms are our atoms now. The rain that fell on their cities falls on our fields. The air they breathed is the air we breathe. We are not separate from them, just as we are not separate from the trees or the oceans or the quiet, ancient rocks. We are threads in a single, continuous weave, a weave that spans not just space, but time. And when you see the world that way, something in you softens. The urgency of domination, the illusion of separateness, begins to fade. You start to understand that harm done to the world is harm done to yourself, that care for the world is care for yourself. This is not just philosophy, it is survival. The systems that sustain us, the air, the water, the soil, the countless relationships between species, are delicate. They are resilient, but only to a point. To live as though we are outside of them, above them, is to court the same collapse that may have ended those who came before. Connection, then, is not just a feeling. It is a practice. It is the daily work of remembering that our actions, however small, are part of a much larger story. Think about a single tree. It pulls carbon from the air, releases oxygen, shelters birds, feeds insects, cools the soil, slows the wind. Cut that tree, and the effects ripple outward. Plant a tree, and the effects ripple too, in ways you may never see, but that matter all the same. Now scale that up to an entire civilization. Every choice we make, the energy we use, the systems we build, the way we treat the land and the water and the air, sends ripples into the deep future. Some of those ripples will be scars, others can be gifts. And maybe that is what it means to truly belong to deep time, to live in such a way that the ripples you send forward make the world more whole, more alive, more capable of carrying the story onward. This sense of connection changes everything. It changes how we think about success, about progress, about what it means to advance. It makes us less obsessed with monuments and more attentive to systems, less concerned with being remembered and more concerned with being responsible. And in that shift, there is a kind of quiet hope, because if deep time teaches anything, it is that life is resilient, adaptive, endlessly creative. Even after collapse, even after erasure, life finds a way to continue. If we can learn to see ourselves not as the pinnacle, but as participants, not as masters, but as stewards, then maybe, just maybe, our story will not end in silence, but in a balance that allows whatever comes next to inherit not just our mistakes, but our wisdom. There is a paradox in thinking about deep time. On one hand, it makes everything feel impossibly small. The empires we build, the stories we tell, the monuments we raise, they all collapse under the weight of billions of years. From that perspective, what we do seems almost irrelevant, but sit with that feeling long enough, and something shifts. You begin to see that smallness is not meaninglessness. In fact, it can be a kind of freedom. If nothing you build will last forever, then the point of building is not permanence, it is presence. The act itself becomes the meaning. Think of a sand mandala, painstakingly created, grain by grain, only to be swept away when it is complete. The beauty is in the making, in the focus, in the care, not in how long it remains. Our lives, our societies, even our species are like that. Temporary, fleeting, and yet while they exist, they are everything. The choices we make in this brief window ripple outward, shaping not only our own experience, but the systems that will persist long after us. If there were civilizations before us, their presence mattered in ways they could never fully see. Their actions altered the chemistry of the air and the oceans, the balance of species, the shape of landscapes. Those changes flowed forward, influencing what came after, even if no one remembers their names, their languages, or their dreams. We are no different. Every decision we make, as individuals, as communities, as a species, carries weight, even if that weight is invisible to us. When we burn forests, we shift the carbon balance. When we protect ecosystems, we preserve networks of life that ripple outward into resilience and abundance. When we choose empathy over fear, cooperation over conflict, we shape the cultural currents that will define the generations that follow. Deep time is not asking us to despair, it is asking us to pay attention, to understand that what we do here and now matters, not because it will be remembered, but because it will echo, because the ripples we create will carry forward in ways we cannot predict, shaping a future we will never see, but that will be no less real for our absence. And in that way, the weight of the present is immense, not heavy in a crushing way, but heavy in a sacred way. Every moment matters, not because it will last forever, but because it is here, now, and because it will never come again. Perhaps that is the truest lesson of deep time, that meaning is not in duration, but in depth, in how fully we show up for the small slice of eternity that we are given. Perspective is a rare thing in human history. Most of our ancestors lived in small worlds, bounded by the horizon, limited by what they could see and touch. Their stories were local, their timescales short. Even the boldest myths stretched only a few thousand years into the past and a few thousand into the future. But now we are beginning to see more. We can trace the history of the planet back billions of years, and we can imagine futures that stretch just as far forward. We can look up at the night sky and know, with a kind of aching clarity, that we are staring at light that has travelled for millions, even billions, of years to reach us. This perspective changes you. It humbles you, yes, but it also opens something inside you. It allows you to see that you are part of a story so vast, so intricate, that it defies comprehension. And once you see that, it becomes harder to cling to the illusions that so often divide us. The illusion that one nation, one people, one belief system, one generation is the center of everything. The illusion that what we do in isolation doesn't matter. Perspective shows you that everything is connected, that the air we breathe is shared, that the systems that sustain us are fragile but enduring, capable of healing if we let them, that our smallness does not diminish our importance. It situates us, reminding us that we are participants, not spectators, in the grand experiment of life. This perspective also softens the fear of impermanence. If civilizations have risen and fallen before, if even the grandest of them have been erased by time, then our task is not to fight that truth, but to make peace with it, to understand that impermanence is not failure, it is simply the nature of existence. And once you accept that, something remarkable happens. You begin to find meaning, not in what lasts, but in what is, in the quiet beauty of a morning, in the laughter of someone you love, in the slow, patient work of healing a piece of land, or teaching a child, or tending to a friendship. Perspective does not erase the urgency of our challenges. If anything, it sharpens it. It makes clear that the systems we are unraveling, the climate, the biodiversity, the balance of life on this planet, are precious not because they will always be here, but because they are here now, and because they are the foundation for whatever comes next. Perhaps that is the real gift of imagining that we are not the first. It takes the focus off of us as the center of the story and places us, instead, as stewards of a moment. This moment, a moment that will not come again. And maybe, just maybe, if we can hold that perspective long enough, we can make choices that honor the gift we have been given. Choices that make the future, whatever it is, a little more whole, a little more alive, a little more capable of carrying forward the quiet wonder that is life. Progress. It's a word we repeat so often that we rarely stop to question what it means. To most of us, progress means growth. Bigger cities, faster machines, newer technologies, taller towers and brighter screens, and the constant hum of production that signals we are moving forward. But what if that definition is flawed? What if the very thing we call progress is in fact the source of the instability we now face? If there were civilizations before us, they may have made the same mistake. They may have equated advancement with expansion, more energy, more consumption, more control over the systems around them. And in doing so, they may have reached the same tipping points we now see in our own world. Warming climates, disrupted ecosystems, dwindling resources, and the quiet, creeping realization that growth without balance is a path that eventually collapses. True progress, in the language of deep time, is not about how brightly you burn. It's about how steadily you endure. Think of the ecosystems that have lasted for millions of years. The rainforests, the coral reefs, the deep ocean communities clustered around hydrothermal vents. These systems are complex, adaptive, and, above all, balanced. They do not grow endlessly. They grow within limits. They recycle, they adapt. They sustain life not just for a moment, but for spans of time so long we struggle to comprehend them. Imagine if we measured our own progress not by GDP or consumption, but by balance, by the health of our ecosystems, the resilience of our communities, the depth of our connections to one another and to the world around us. That shift in perspective would change everything. It would change the way we build cities, designing them not as engines of consumption, but as living systems, integrated with the rhythms of the land and the water and the air. It would change the way we use technology, moving from extraction and exploitation to regeneration and restoration. It would change the way we define success, not in terms of dominance or accumulation, but in terms of harmony, equity, and endurance. And perhaps most importantly, it would change the story we tell about ourselves. No longer the conquerors of the earth, but its caretakers. No longer the pinnacle of evolution, but one of countless threads in a tapestry that stretches across time and space. This is not a call to abandon technology or to retreat into some imagined past. Technology is not the problem. The problem is the story we have attached to it, the story that tells us that faster, bigger, louder is always better. If there were civilizations before us, perhaps the ones that endured, if any endured, were those that learned to write a different story. A story of restraint, a story of balance, a story of knowing when enough is enough. Progress, then, is not a straight line. It is a spiral, a cycle of learning and unlearning, of reaching forward and returning to first principles, that we are part of a system, that the system has limits, and that within those limits there is space for abundance, creativity, and wonder. Survival is the baseline. It is what every species, every civilization strives for. To endure, to persist, to make it through the next season, the next century, the next cycle of change. But to thrive, that is something different. That is something rarer, more fragile, and more beautiful. Thriving is not just about meeting needs. It is about flourishing, about creating systems where life, in all its diversity, can not only survive, but expand into its full potential. In our current story, we often confuse thriving with accumulation. We think that to thrive is to own more, to build more, to consume more. But deep time offers a different lesson, that true thriving is about balance, connection, and resilience. Look at the forests. They thrive not because any single tree dominates, but because of the relationships between them. The networks of roots and fungi that share nutrients, the balance of light and shade, the constant dance of give and take that allows the whole system to endure. Look at the oceans. They thrive not because of any single species, but because of the intricate web of interactions. The plankton that feed the fish that feed the whales whose movements help cycle nutrients that sustain the plankton. Thriving is a collective state. It is something that emerges when the parts of a system are in balance, when the needs of the many are held in tension with the needs of the few, when cooperation and adaptation are valued as highly as competition and innovation. Imagine what our civilization could look like if thriving, not growth, were the goal. Our cities could become green and breathable, powered by energy that doesn't poison the air or the water. Our economies could be designed to regenerate rather than deplete, creating abundance without collapse. Our cultures could celebrate connection over consumption, depth over distraction, meaning over noise. This is not some utopian fantasy. The tools to begin this shift already exist. What is missing is not technology but imagination, the willingness to tell a different story about who we are and what we value. If there were civilizations before us, perhaps some of them found this balance. Perhaps they learned too late that survival without thriving is a hollow victory, that endurance without harmony is just a slower kind of collapse. We are at a crossroads now. We can continue down the path of endless growth, of extraction and acceleration, of believing that we are separate from the systems that sustain us. Or we can choose something different, a path that honours the delicate balance of this world, that seeks not to dominate but to participate, that measures success not in what we take but in what we give. To thrive is to understand that our well-being is bound up in the well-being of everything around us, that the health of the forests and the rivers and the oceans is our health too, that the survival of other species is not a luxury but a necessity, woven into the same systems that make our own survival possible. And in that understanding, there is hope, because if thriving is about balance, about connection, about systems that sustain rather than collapse, then every small act of care, every choice to repair rather than destroy, Every effort to live more gently is a step toward that possibility. Deep time reminds us that thriving is rare, but not impossible. Life has found balance before. Systems have endured, not for centuries, but for millions of years. We are not separate from that story. We are part of it. And if we can learn that, if we can truly internalize the lessons written in the quiet, patient language of the earth, then perhaps we can write a chapter that does not end in silence, but in harmony. Innovation is perhaps our most defining trait. From the moment one of our ancestors first shaped a stone into a sharper edge, we have been a species that dreams of what could be, a species that looks at the world and sees not just what is, but what might be. That impulse has carried us far. It has lit the night with fire and electricity, carried our voices across oceans, lifted our machines beyond the atmosphere and into the black quiet of space. It has allowed us to heal illnesses once thought incurable, to extend our lives, to understand, in broad strokes at least, the deep workings of the universe. But innovation without humility is a dangerous thing. It can become a kind of blindness, a belief that because we can do something, we should, that because we have the power to alter the world, we have the wisdom to do it well. If there were civilizations before us, perhaps this is where they stumbled. Perhaps their reach exceeded their understanding. Perhaps they discovered forces they could not control, built systems they could not maintain, or extracted from their world until there was nothing left to sustain them. Humility is not the opposite of innovation. It is its necessary partner. It is the quiet voice that asks, should we? It is the discipline to pause, to observe, to understand the systems we are part of before we tear them apart in the name of progress. Consider the forests. For centuries we saw them only as resources, trees to be cut, land to be cleared. Only now are we beginning to understand the complexity of these systems, the intricate networks that allow forests to communicate, to share nutrients, to adapt. We took before we understood, and in doing so, we damage systems we now realize we depend on. The same is true for our atmosphere, our oceans, our soils. We innovate in ways that alter them without fully grasping the consequences, and then we scramble to repair what we have broken. Humility asks us to slow down, not to stop dreaming, not to stop building, but to build with awareness, with a sense of the fragility of the systems we depend on and the long timelines in which our choices will echo. Innovation with humility looks different. It looks like energy systems that mimic the balance of ecosystems, cycling and recycling instead of consuming and discarding. It looks like technologies that heal as much as they build, that restore what they disrupt, that align with the rhythms of the world instead of fighting against them. It also looks like a cultural shift, from seeing the earth as a thing we own to seeing it as a partner, a home, a system we are part of rather than separate from. If we can learn that lesson, if we can pair our restless curiosity with a deep respect for the limits and balances of the world, then perhaps we can write a story that is not just another rise and fall, but a rise that becomes something steadier, something enduring. Because the truth is, we are not the first species to innovate. Life has been innovating for billions of years. The structures of a leaf, the strength of a spider's web, the resilience of a coral reef, these are technologies honed over unimaginable spans of time, and none of them break the systems they are part of. They fit, they endure. Our challenge, then, is not to suppress innovation, but to mature it, to grow beyond the impulse to consume and dominate, and toward an impulse to integrate, to balance, to innovate in ways that allow life, in all its diversity, to thrive alongside us. Curiosity is the spark that drives every discovery we have ever made. It is the quiet question that asks, what if? It is the restless itch that pushes us to explore, to experiment, to reach beyond what we know. Without curiosity, we would still be huddled in the dark, our world bounded by the limits of what we could see and touch. With it, we have mapped the stars, split the atom, peered into the strange fabric of space-time, and begun to understand our place in the vastness of the cosmos. Curiosity is not the problem. Curiosity is the gift. The danger lies in how we direct it, in whether we let it become a tool for extraction and control, or a compass that guides us toward deeper understanding and wiser choices. Imagine a civilization that let curiosity lead, but never allowed it to outrun wisdom. A civilization that explored not to conquer, but to learn. That built not to dominate, but to harmonize. That measured progress, not in what it consumed, but in what it understood. Perhaps such a civilization could endure. Perhaps such a civilization could navigate the delicate balance between innovation and humility, curiosity and caution, exploration and stewardship. For us, that means cultivating a different kind of curiosity, one that is as interested in the small as in the vast, in the quiet systems of this planet as in the distant galaxies we dream of reaching. It means asking not just what can we do, but what should we do? Not just what is possible, but what is wise. This kind of curiosity does not diminish our sense of wonder, it deepens it. It invites us to look more closely at the systems we take for granted, the soil that feeds us, the rivers that sustain us, the air that carries our voices and our breath, and to see them not as resources, but as marvels. It also invites us to imagine futures that are not dystopias of collapse or utopias of endless growth, but something quieter and more sustainable. A world in which we have learned to live well within our limits, to build in ways that heal, to dream in ways that do not consume. If there were civilizations before us, perhaps some of them reached this place. Perhaps some of them learned that curiosity is not just a tool for advancement, but a compass for balance, a way of orienting themselves in the vastness of time and space. And perhaps that is the path that is open to us now, if we choose to take it, because curiosity, at its core, is about connection. It is about seeing the world not as something to be used, but as something to be understood, something to be in relationship with. It is about recognizing that every question we ask about the stars, about the deep ocean, about the quiet workings of our own minds, is in some way a question about ourselves and our place in the story. And maybe that is what will carry us forward, not just as a civilization, but as a species, the willingness to keep asking, to keep listening, to keep wondering, even when the answers are slow to come. Because in the end, it is not certainty that makes us wise. It is curiosity, paired with humility, that allows us to navigate the unknown, to find balance, to adapt, to endure. Every choice we make is louder than we realize. A plastic bottle discarded in a gutter, a forest cleared for farmland, a river dammed to generate electricity. Each act feels small in the moment, but deep time has no concept of small. In 1,000 years, that plastic could still be there. In 100,000, the scars of our dams and mines may still be visible in the rock. This is not to shame us, it is to remind us that the story we are writing is not confined to our lifetimes or even to our species. It is a story that will echo forward into ages we cannot imagine. Consider the concept of the techno-fossil. Scientists today can already trace the beginnings of what may one day be a geological layer marking the Anthropocene, our time. Buried in that layer will be traces of our plastics, our concrete, our metals, even our nuclear isotopes. Millions of years from now, some future intelligence, perhaps another species, perhaps even descendants of our own, could unearth that layer and know without question that something happened here. The question is, what will that story say? Will it tell of a species that burned bright and burned out, leaving behind nothing but traces of destruction? Or will it tell of a species that woke up in time, that learned to live within the delicate systems of its planet, that left behind not just scars, but signs of healing, of balance, of care? Because deep time does not judge, it simply records. The rivers we poison will carry those chemicals into the sediment. The species we drive extinct will vanish, leaving empty niches that will take millennia to fill. The carbon we pump into the air will settle into stone, a chemical memory of our age. But just as our harm leaves traces, so does our care. A reforested valley becomes a refuge for countless species. Protected coral reefs rebuild their complex, fragile ecosystems. Rivers once polluted run clear again, their banks alive with birds and insects. These acts, quiet, often unseen, ripple forward too. They create conditions for resilience, for balance, for a planet that can recover, adapt, and continue the long, slow story of life. And that, perhaps, is the most humbling and empowering truth of all, that deep time will remember us, not in names or monuments, but in the systems we alter, in the chemistry of the air, in the richness of the soil, in the complexity of the ecosystems that will grow and change long after we are gone. To live with that awareness is to carry a kind of responsibility, not heavy, not crushing, but sacred. The responsibility to see our choices not as isolated, but as threads in a tapestry that stretches across millions of years. And if we can learn to carry that awareness, perhaps we can make different choices. Choices that honour the gift of this moment. Choices that leave echoes we can be proud of, even if no one is here to remember our names. When we think of power, we often imagine it as something grand and loud. The ability to command, to control, to shape the world in obvious ways. But deep time teaches us that the most profound power is often quiet. A seed, no bigger than a fingernail, can grow into a tree that lives for centuries, shaping the soil, the air, the water, the lives of countless species. A single act of kindness, a teacher encouraging a child, a scientist sharing her data freely, a community protecting a patch of forest, can ripple outward in ways no one could have predicted, changing not just the present, but the future. This is the quiet power of choice. Each of us in every moment is making choices that ripple outward. What we eat, what we buy, how we speak, how we vote, how we care, all of it matters. Not because any single act will save or doom the world, but because together they create the current that shapes our collective story. In the face of deep time, it is easy to feel powerless. What difference can one person make in a story that spans billions of years? But that is an illusion born of scale. Because every great shift, every great transformation, begins with countless small acts. The forests are built one tree at a time. The reefs are built one coral at a time. The rivers are shaped one drop at a time. And so it is with us. The choices we make, to consume less, to restore more, to build systems that heal instead of harm, are the seeds of a different future, a future in which our species is not just a brief flash of brilliance, but a steady, enduring presence in the long story of life. This is not about perfection. It is not about purity. It is about direction, about choosing, again and again, to move toward balance, toward connection, toward systems that allow all life to thrive. And perhaps that is the true gift of knowing we may not be the first. The reminder that the story is not fixed, that we can choose differently, that we can learn from the silence of those who may have come before us and write a different ending. Because the future is not inevitable. It is being written now in the quiet, ordinary choices of billions of people. Choices that, together, will decide what kind of story deep time will tell about us. Will it be a story of hubris and collapse, of a species that reached too far and fell too hard? Or will it be a story of awakening, of a species that learned, in time, to live well within its limits, to build a civilization not of conquest but of care, not of endless growth but of balance? That is the story we are writing, moment by moment, choice by choice. And the beauty of that truth, the quiet, humbling beauty, is that every one of us has a hand in the pen. Humility is a rare quality in civilizations. Nations rise, industries flourish, and with success comes the illusion of control, the belief that we have mastered the forces of nature, that we have bent the world to our will. But the truth whispered quietly in every forest, every ocean, every shifting sky is that control is an illusion. We are not the masters of this planet. We are participants in a system that is far older, far more complex, and far more adaptive than we can comprehend. To live without humility is to live in conflict with reality. It is to build cities on fault lines and be shocked when the earth moves. It is to clear the forests and then grieve when the rains no longer come. It is to heat the air and the oceans and then wonder at the ferocity of storms. Humility asks us to pause, to listen, not just to ourselves, but to the quiet languages of the world we inhabit. The rustle of leaves that tell us when the seasons are shifting. The movements of birds and insects that reveal the health of ecosystems. The data we gather from ice cores, from soil, from the quiet archives of the earth, showing us how the planet has responded to change in the past. If there were civilizations before us, perhaps some of them ignored those whispers until it was too late. Perhaps their confidence in their own mastery blinded them to the limits of their systems until those systems collapsed. Humility does not mean retreat. It does not mean abandoning progress or living in fear of change. It means recognizing that progress without balance is a path that always leads to the same place. Collapse followed by silence. When we listen, truly listen, we begin to see that the earth is not an obstacle to be overcome, but a teacher. Its systems are elegant, efficient, balanced. They waste nothing. They adapt endlessly. And they remind us, again and again, that resilience is not found in domination, but in integration. To listen with humility is to let those lessons shape the way we live. It is to design cities that mimic ecosystems, that recycle energy and resources in closed loops. It is to grow food in ways that restore the soil rather than deplete it. It is to build technologies that work with the rhythms of the world instead of against them. This kind of humility is not weakness, it is wisdom. It is the recognition that to endure, to truly thrive, we must move from seeing ourselves as the center of the story to seeing ourselves as part of a story far larger, far older, and far more intricate than we can imagine. And maybe, just maybe, that shift in perspective, from mastery to participation, from arrogance to humility, is what will allow us to write a different ending to our chapter in the long history of life. There is an old truth, one we seem to forget in the noise of our modern lives, that wisdom is rarely born in isolation. We live in a time that glorifies the individual, the lone genius, the solitary hero, the single voice that rises above the crowd. But the systems we are part of do not work that way. Nature thrives on networks, on collaboration, on countless small interactions that together create resilience and balance. Perhaps we could too. Collective wisdom is not about agreement. It is not about everyone thinking the same way or believing the same thing. It is about diversity of thought, of perspective, of experience, and the slow, patient work of weaving those threads together into something stronger than any one voice could create alone. Imagine a civilization that truly valued that kind of wisdom. A civilization that made decisions not from fear or greed or the narrow vision of the moment, but from a deep, patient listening to many voices, human and non-human alike. A civilization that measured success not by how quickly it could extract and consume, but by how well it could adapt, integrate, and sustain. In some ways, we are closer to that than we realize. The tools exist, not just in technology, but in the quiet wisdom of communities that have lived in balance with their environments for generations. Indigenous knowledge, often dismissed or ignored, carries insights that could guide us towards systems of resilience and restoration. Collective wisdom asks us to slow down, to value process as much as outcome, to recognize that complexity cannot be managed with quick fixes and single solutions. It asks us to hold space for uncertainty, to remain curious, to keep asking questions even when the answers are not clear. And perhaps most importantly, It asks us to see ourselves not as isolated individuals, but as part of a collective, not just of humanity, but of life itself. Every choice we make is made within a web of relationships, to the land, to the water, to the air, to one another. When we forget that, our choices fracture the systems that sustain us. When we remember it, our choices can repair, restore, and regenerate. If there were civilizations before us, perhaps some of them understood this. Perhaps they learned through failure, through collapse, through the slow lessons of time, that the only way forward was together. Collective wisdom is not easy. It requires humility, patience, and the willingness to let go of the illusion of control. It requires us to value listening as highly as speaking, and to understand that no single perspective holds the whole truth. But it is, perhaps, our best chance. Because the challenges we face now, climate change, biodiversity loss, the fragile systems of food and water and energy that sustain billions of lives, are not challenges that can be solved by individuals acting alone. They require the slow, steady work of collective action, guided by collective wisdom. And the beauty of that truth, the quiet hope in it, is that it means every one of us has a role to play. Every voice matters. Every act of care, every choice to repair rather than destroy, every effort to listen and to learn becomes part of a larger story of resilience and balance. Perhaps that is what will define us in deep time. Not our monuments, not our machines, not the noise of our brief moment of brilliance, but the quiet, enduring wisdom of a species that learned, finally, how to live together, with one another and with the world that holds us. Resilience is a word we love to use. We talk about resilient communities, resilient systems, resilient minds. It's a comforting idea that we can bend but not break, that we can weather the storms of change and come out the other side stronger. But resilience is not a given. It is something that must be cultivated, tended, and understood. And history, deep time even, reminds us that resilience has limits. Civilizations collapse. It is not a question of if, but when. Every empire that has risen has eventually fallen. Every complex system that grows too rigid, too brittle, too dependent on endless expansion, eventually reaches a point where it can no longer adapt. Collapse, in this sense, is not failure. It is a natural part of the cycle of complexity. Systems grow, adapt, stabilize, and then, when the conditions that sustain them change, they falter. They break down. What matters is what happens next. In the ruins of every collapse, there are seeds of renewal. In the ashes of forests, burned by wildfire, new life takes hold. In the quiet after storms, ecosystems rebuild. In the spaces left by failing systems, there is room for something new to emerge. Something more adaptive, more balanced, more attuned to the realities of the world around it. If there were civilizations before us, perhaps they too experienced this cycle. Perhaps their brilliance gave way to overreach, to imbalance, to systems that could not sustain themselves. Perhaps they fell, but in their falling, they left behind lessons, legacies, and traces that shaped what came after. Resilience, then, is not about avoiding collapse at all costs. It is about building systems that can adapt when collapse comes. Systems that can bend without breaking, that can absorb shocks without unraveling completely, that can recover, not to what was, but to something new, something more capable of enduring the realities of a changing world. For us, that might mean rethinking the way we build everything, from our cities to our economies to our cultures. It might mean designing for flexibility instead of permanence, for adaptation instead of control, for systems that regenerate themselves instead of depleting the foundations they rest on. It also means cultivating resilience in ourselves, the inner resilience to face uncertainty without fear, to navigate change without clinging to what is familiar, to find meaning and purpose even when the old stories no longer hold. because resilience is not just a structural quality, it is a cultural one. It is the ability to imagine different futures, to let go of the illusion of permanence, to embrace the truth that change, even painful change, can be the beginning of something new. If we can learn that lesson, if we can build that kind of resilience, then collapse, when it comes, need not be the end of our story. It can be the moment we finally begin to write a different kind of story. One rooted not in endless growth but in balance, not in dominance but in participation, not in fear of change, but in the quiet confidence that we can adapt, endure, and perhaps finally learn. Renewal often begins in silence, not in the noise of collapse, not in the chaos of systems unraveling, but in the quiet after, when the dust has settled, when the old certainties have fallen away, and when there is space at last for something new to take root. Nature teaches us this lesson again and again. A forest burned by wildfire looks like devastation, charred trunks, ash where there was once green. But wait, and you will see the first signs of renewal. Seedlings sprouting in the ash, birds returning to nest, insects working in the soil. The fire, destructive as it seemed, created conditions for regeneration. It cleared the underbrush, released nutrients, opened space for new growth. Human systems are not so different. Collapse is painful. It brings loss, uncertainty, fear. But in its aftermath, there is often a strange kind of possibility. A chance to rebuild not what was, but what could be. If we are willing to listen to that possibility, to let go of the reflex, to simply restore the old systems, then renewal can be profound. Imagine for a moment that the systems we take for granted today, the extractive economies, the endless growth models, the disconnection from the ecosystems that sustain us, were to falter, to collapse. It would be painful, yes, disorienting, but it could also be the moment we begin to build something better. Communities might rediscover the value of local resilience, of food grown close to home, of energy produced sustainably, of networks of care that do not depend on fragile global systems. Our relationship with the natural world might shift from one of extraction to one of reciprocity, as we begin to see, with a clarity born of necessity, that our well-being is inseparable from the well-being of the systems around us. Our cultures might begin to tell new stories, stories of balance, of humility, of a species that finally learned to take its place in the web of life instead of trying to stand above it. Renewal is not easy. It requires grief for what is lost, for what cannot be recovered. It requires patience, the kind of patience that trusts that slow, steady change is more enduring than quick fixes. It requires imagination, the willingness to see possibility where others see only endings. But it is possible. It has happened before. In the wake of every collapse, there have been those who carried forward seeds of renewal, ideas, practices, stories that allowed new systems to grow. If there were civilizations before us, perhaps that is their quiet gift to us, not their monuments or their machines, but the traces of their resilience, the lessons embedded in the patterns of the world they left behind. And perhaps one day that will be our gift too, not in the artifacts we leave buried in the layers of the earth, but in the systems we create now, systems that heal, that endure, that make space for life to flourish long after we are gone. Because in the end, renewal is not about us. It is about life itself, the stubborn, insistent force that has carried this planet through 5 mass extinctions, through ice ages and asteroid impacts, through cycles of collapse and rebirth that stretch across billions of years. We are part of that story, and if we choose to be, we can be part of the renewal too. Imagination has always been our quiet superpower. It is what allowed our ancestors, with little more than fire and stone, to picture a world beyond their immediate needs. It is what drove the first sailors to leave the safety of the shore, the first builders to raise monuments that touch the sky, the first dreamers to look at the stars and wonder what lay beyond them. But imagination is not only about what we can create, It is also about what we can choose to become. Right now, our imagination is often trapped in cycles of growth and consumption, trapped in stories that tell us there is no alternative to the way things are, trapped in futures that are either apocalyptic or endlessly expansive, with little space for nuance, balance, or quiet endurance. And yet imagination can be a survival tool. To imagine is to step outside the momentum of the present, to glimpse possibilities that do not yet exist. It is what allows us to ask, what if we measured success not by what we own, but by what we sustain? What if our cities were not engines of consumption, but living systems that breathed and recycled and supported the ecosystems around them? What if progress was not defined by speed, but by harmony? Imagination, in this way, becomes an act of rebellion, a refusal to accept that the way things are is the way they must always be. If there were civilizations before us, perhaps the ones that endured, if any endured, were those that learned to imagine differently, those that learned to tell new stories about what it meant to thrive, stories that prioritize balance, connection, and endurance over conquest and expansion. We have that capacity too. We always have. The question is not whether we can imagine a different future, but whether we will allow ourselves to. Imagination also demands courage, because to imagine a different world is to confront the reality that the systems we take for granted are not inevitable, and that we have the power and the responsibility to change them. It is easier, in many ways, to believe that collapse is inevitable. It absolves us of the burden of imagining something better. But deep time reminds us that life is not static, that systems can change, that balance can be restored in ways that are slow, quiet, and profound. Our challenge is to let our imagination expand beyond fear and beyond greed, into a space where possibility lives. Because imagination is not just about the future, it is about the present, about seeing the small choices, the quiet acts of care, the slow work of repair that together begin to shape the world into something new. And perhaps if we can learn to imagine that kind of future, one rooted not in endless growth but in enduring balance, then we can begin here and now to make it real. Empathy is often dismissed as something soft, something secondary to the hard mechanics of survival. But the truth is, empathy has always been one of our greatest strengths. It is empathy that allowed small bands of humans to cooperate, to share resources, to care for the sick and the weak, to raise children in communities where survival was a collective effort rather than an individual struggle. It is empathy that built trust, that created networks of support, that allowed us to thrive not as solitary creatures, but as deeply social ones. And empathy, like imagination, may be the key to our survival now. Because the challenges we face, from climate change to resource scarcity to the quiet, creeping disconnection of our digital age, are not problems that can be solved by logic alone. They require connection. They require us to feel deeply the ways in which our lives are bound up with the lives of others, human and non-human alike. To feel the loss of a disappearing species not as an abstract statistic, but as a wound to the fabric of life we are part of. To see the suffering caused by floods, by fires, by storms, not as distant tragedies, but as calls to solidarity and care. To recognize that the health of our rivers, our forests, our soils is not separate from our own health, but inseparable from it. Empathy allows us to expand the circle of what we consider us. And as that circle expands, our choices begin to shift. We begin to design systems that care not only for human needs, but for the ecosystems that sustain us. We begin to value the quiet resilience of balance over the noisy urgency of growth. We begin to see that to care for the world is, in the deepest sense, to care for ourselves. If there were civilizations before us, perhaps some of them learned this lesson too late. Perhaps their collapse was hastened by disconnection, by systems that valued power and extraction over care and reciprocity. We do not have to repeat that story. Empathy, like imagination, can be cultivated. It grows in the small, daily acts of attention and care, in listening to one another, in tending to the places we live, in choosing to see the world not as a collection of resources, but as a network of relationships. It grows when we allow ourselves to slow down, to notice the quiet miracles around us, the way the air smells after rain, the sound of birds returning in the morning, the slow, steady work of plants reclaiming a patch of abandoned soil. And in that slowing, in that noticing, we begin to remember something we have always known, that we are not separate from this world, but part of it, that our survival, our thriving, our very sense of meaning is tied to the systems that hold us, the relationships that sustain us, the delicate balance that allows life, in all its forms, to continue. Empathy is not weakness, it is wisdom. It is the recognition that strength is found not in isolation, but in connection. That resilience is built not on domination, but on care. That the future we long for, a future of balance, of harmony, of quiet endurance, will be built not by force, but by compassion. Wonder is where it all begins. Long before we had tools or language, long before we could write or build or measure, we had wonder. A rustle in the trees, the glint of light on water, the infinite tapestry of stars unfolding across a night sky. Something in us paused, something in us looked closer, something in us asked, "What is this and what does it mean?" That simple, profound pause, that spark of curiosity, is the thread that connects every discovery, every insight, every story we have ever told. Wonder is what drives us to explore, to create, to seek meaning in a universe that is vast and indifferent, and yet somehow, impossibly, alive with possibility. But wonder is not only the spark of invention, it is also the quiet foundation of humility. To stand in wonder at the vastness of the cosmos is to be reminded of our smallness, not as a diminishment, but as a kind of freedom. We do not have to control everything. We do not have to be the center of the story. We are part of something vast, something intricate, something we may never fully understand, but can always marvel at. And perhaps that, more than anything, is what we need now. Because wonder slows us down. It interrupts the relentless push toward growth and consumption. It reminds us that there is value in simply being present, in noticing the beauty and complexity of the systems we are part of. To look at a forest and see not just timber, but a living network, older and wiser than we are. To look at the ocean and see not just a resource, but a cradle of life, teeming with mysteries we have barely begun to understand. To look at the night sky and feel, if only for a moment, that ancient humbling awareness, that we are small, that we are brief, and that in our smallness and brevity lies a kind of sacredness. If there were civilizations before us, perhaps they too began with wonder. Perhaps their first steps toward knowledge, toward complexity, toward civilization itself, were guided by that quiet awe at the world around them. But perhaps as they grew, they forgot. Perhaps they began to see the world not as a mystery to be cherished, but as a resource to be consumed, a problem to be solved, a thing to be owned. And perhaps that forgetting, that turning away from wonder, was the beginning of their decline. We do not have to follow that path. We can choose to keep wonder at the center of our story, to let it shape our science, our art, our technology, our systems. To ask not just what we can do, but what will allow us to keep marveling at the world, at one another, at the strange, fleeting gift of being alive in this moment. Because wonder is not a luxury, it is a survival tool. It keeps us humble, it keeps us curious, it keeps us connected to the systems that sustain us. And in that connection, there is resilience. The quiet, steady resilience of a species that remembers it is part of a larger whole. Gratitude is quieter than wonder, but no less powerful. It is not the loud gratitude of obligation, of polite thanks, but the deep, almost wordless gratitude that comes from recognizing how much of our lives is a gift. The air we breathe, the water that moves through our bodies and our soils and our skies, the food that grows from the alchemy of soil and sunlight, of pollinators and rain, the warmth of another person's hand, the sound of laughter, the quiet comfort of being known. Gratitude shifts our attention. It pulls us out of the endless striving for more and roots us in the quiet abundance of what already is. It reminds us that our lives are woven from threads we did not spin alone, that every moment of survival, every breath, every beat of our hearts is part of a web of relationships far larger and more generous than we often realize. And when we live in that awareness, our choices change. We begin to move more slowly, to consume more carefully, to repair instead of discard. We begin to see the systems around us not as inert resources, but as living relationships deserving of care and reciprocity. We begin to understand that every act of destruction, every polluted river, every felled forest, every extinguished species is not just a loss, but a breaking of trust, a wound in the delicate balance that sustains us. Gratitude does not paralyze us with guilt. It energizes us with care. It invites us to act not out of fear or shame, but out of love. Love for the world that holds us. Love for the people and places that shape us. Love for the possibility of futures where life in all its forms can flourish. If there were civilizations before us, perhaps their survival, if any of them endured, depended on this quiet, steady practice of gratitude. Perhaps those that collapsed had lost it, had come to see the world only in terms of extraction and consumption, forgetting that to take without giving is to unweave the very systems that sustain you. Gratitude, like empathy and imagination, can be cultivated. It grows in the small moments of noticing, the way light filters through leaves, the hum of bees in a garden, the rhythm of waves on a shore. It grows when we pause, when we breathe, when we remember that nothing we have, not our food, not our homes, not our very existence, happens in isolation. And as it grows, it changes us. It makes us gentler, more careful, more willing to choose the slower, quieter path that nurtures instead of depletes. In this way, gratitude becomes not just a feeling, but a guide, a compass pointing us towards systems, choices, and futures that honor the delicate balance of the world we inhabit. It asks us to measure our progress not by what we accumulate, but by what we sustain. Not by how much we can take, but by how much we can give back to the soils that feed us, to the waters that carry us, to the countless forms of life that share this planet with us. And perhaps, if we can learn to live with that kind of gratitude, we can write a story that will echo not as a cautionary tale, but as a quiet, enduring testament that here, in this brief moment of deep time, there was a species that learned to live not as a conqueror, but as a participant, not as a consumer, but as a caretaker, not as a fleeting flash, but as a steady, balanced presence in the long unfolding story of life. There is a thread that runs through everything we have explored, through deep time, through collapse and renewal, through the quiet gifts of imagination, empathy, wonder, and gratitude. It is the thread of connection. Connection is what allowed life to flourish on this planet long before we were here. The endless, intricate relationships between soil and water, air and light, predator and prey, fungus and root. It is what allowed us, fragile and vulnerable, to survive long enough to build tools, to form language, to tell stories. It is what sustains us even now, in ways we often forget but can never escape. We like to imagine ourselves as separate. We build walls and draw borders and tell stories of individualism and control. But the reality is simpler, humbler, and far more profound. We are woven into everything around us. The air we breathe is the exhalation of forests and oceans. The food we eat is the result of countless relationships: soil microbes, pollinators, rain cycles, human labor. The technologies we build are the result of centuries of shared knowledge, of discoveries passed down, refined and combined by countless hands and minds. To remember that connection is to remember that we are not alone and that we never have been. If there were civilizations before us, perhaps they too discovered this thread. Perhaps those that endured did so because they honoured it, because they built systems that worked with the grain of connection instead of against it. And perhaps those that collapsed did so because they forgot, because they allowed the illusion of separation from one another, from the systems that sustained them, to grow so strong that it became their undoing. Our task now, in this moment, is not to invent something entirely new. It is to remember that the thread is already there, woven through everything we are and everything we do. To remember that connection is not weakness, but strength. That our survival, our flourishing, our meaning has always come from our ability to weave ourselves into the fabric of the world around us. This remembering is not abstract, it is practical, tangible, lived. It is in the way we design our cities, our systems, our technologies. It is in the way we teach our children, the stories we tell, the values we hold. It is in the quiet choices we make every day, what we eat, how we travel, how we care for the places we inhabit, and the people who share them with us. The thread of connection is not something we need to create. It is something we need to notice, to honour, to hold with care, because it is delicate, and because when it frays, everything we have built begins to unravel. But when we hold it, when we build systems, cultures, and stories that recognise and honour that connection, something extraordinary happens. Resilience grows, balance returns. Life, in all its wild, intricate abundance, begins to flourish again. And in that flourishing, there is room for us too, not as masters, not as rulers, but as participants in a story far larger and far more beautiful than anything we could write alone. Deep time will remember us, not in the way we often imagine, not in our monuments or our machines, not in the noise of our brief moment of brilliance, but in the quiet, enduring traces we leave behind. A layer of rock marked by our chemistry, a shift in the distribution of species, the absence of those we drove to extinction, and the presence of those that adapted and endured alongside us. That will be our legacy, for better or for worse. But legacy is not fixed. It is not something that happens to us. It is something we are shaping, here and now, in the choices we make and the systems we build. And so the question becomes, what kind of legacy do we want to leave? We could leave behind a cautionary tale, the story of a species that mistook power for wisdom, that consumed until there was nothing left, that collapsed under the weight of its own hubris. Or we could leave something quieter, humbler, more enduring, the story of a species that learned in time to live well. The story of a species that found balance, that built systems not of endless growth, but of care and reciprocity, that honoured the thread of connection, and in doing so, found a way to endure. This second story is quieter. It will not make headlines or monuments, but deep time will notice. The layers of rock will carry traces of balance instead of collapse. The ecosystems we sustain will carry forward into futures we cannot imagine. The quiet hum of life, forests, oceans, skies alive with birdsong, will continue, a testament not to our power, but to our care. That is the legacy we could leave, not dominance, but participation, not noise, but harmony, not a fleeting flash, but a steady presence in the long, slow story of life. And perhaps that is the greatest hope of all, that in this brief, extraordinary moment, we have the chance to choose humility over hubris, connection over separation, care over consumption, to choose to become not the first civilization to collapse, but the first to truly endure. If there were civilizations before us, we cannot change their stories, but we can honour them by learning from the silence they left behind. We can let their absence remind us of what is at stake, and of what is possible when we remember the quiet truths that have always sustained life, that balance is strength, that connection is resilience, that care is the foundation of endurance. And so as this chapter closes, perhaps we can pause, together, wherever we are, whoever we are, and take a moment of gratitude. Gratitude for the chance to be here, in this moment, with the gift of awareness, with the gift of choice, with the thread of connection in our hands. Because in the end, that is what will define us. Not what we built, or what we owned, or what we consumed, but how we cared for one another, for the world, for the quiet, improbable miracle of being alive, here and now, on a planet that has carried life through eons and will, if we allow it, carry life for eons more. And maybe, just maybe, that quiet care will be enough to turn our brief moment into something enduring. Something that deep time will carry forward, not as a warning, but as a whisper of what was possible when a species learned, at last, to remember where it came from and to live as though it belonged.